The rain came down in sheets that Thursday evening, turning the quiet streets of Maplewood into rivers of rushing water. Thomas Chen stood at his kitchen window, watching the storm intensify, a dish towel still in his hands from drying the dinner plates. He was 58 now, his dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, and he'd learned long ago that some things in life you simply couldn't control. The weather was one of them. His daughter Sarah had left for college 3 years ago, and the house felt too big most evenings. But Thomas had made peace with the silence. He'd raised Sarah on his own since she was 7, after his wife passed, and he'd discovered that a man could find purpose in the small rituals of daily life, making coffee each morning, tending the garden out back, keeping the porch light on, even when no one was coming home. The knock at his door came just after 7. Thomas wasn't expecting anyone. He set down the dish towel and walked through the living room, his footsteps soft on the worn hardwood floors, through the frosted glass. Of his front door, he could make out a figure, hunched against the rain. When he opened the door, he found Margaret Sullivan standing on his porch, soaked through to the skin, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. Her car, a sensible gray sedan, sat at the curb with its hazard lights blinking weakly through the downpour. Thomas had known Margaret for nearly 15 years. She was the CEO of the marketing firm where he worked as a senior graphic designer. She was a woman of 62, always impeccably dressed in tailored suits, her silver blonde hair usually styled in a professional bob. But tonight, she looked different, vulnerable, human in a way he'd never quite seen before. "Margaret," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "Come in, please. You're soaked." She hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside, water pooling on his doormat. "I'm so sorry, Thomas. My car died about a block from here. The storm drains are overflowing, and I couldn't get it started again. I tried calling a tow service, but they said it would be hours. I saw your porch light and remembered you lived on this street." Thomas had already disappeared into the hallway closet, returning with thick towels. "Don't apologize. Here, dry off. I'll make some tea." In the kitchen, Thomas filled his old copper kettle and set it on the stove. He could hear Margaret in the living room, still apologizing, still sounding uncertain. It struck him as odd. At work, Margaret was confidence personified. She made decisions that affected hundreds of employees without hesitation. She presented to boardrooms full of executives with the ease of someone discussing the weather. But standing in his living room, shivering and soaked, she seemed like someone else entirely, someone who'd forgotten, perhaps, what it felt like to need help. When he returned with 2 steaming mugs of chamomile tea, Margaret had settled into the corner of his couch, wrapped in the towel. She'd removed her shoes, and Thomas noticed they were expensive designer heels, now ruined by the rain. "I feel ridiculous," she said, accepting the tea with both hands. The CEO showing up at an employee's door like a drowned cat. Thomas lowered himself into the armchair across from her, his own mug warming his palms. "I think tonight we're just 2 people caught in a storm. The titles don't really matter here." Margaret looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her expression softened. "You've always been kind, Thomas. I've noticed that about you over the years." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the rain hammer against the windows. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Thomas had lived through enough Midwestern weather to know this one would last most of the night. "You should stay," he said finally. "The weather service says the flooding will get worse before it gets better." Sarah's room is empty since she left for college. Fresh sheets, quiet and dry. Margaret set down her tea, her hands folding in her lap. "I couldn't impose like that. It's not an imposition. It's just practical." Thomas smiled gently. "Besides, I made pot roast for dinner and there's plenty left. You must be hungry." The truth was, Margaret was hungry. She'd worked through lunch, as she often did, and had planned to grab something on the way home. But more than that, she was tired. Tired of maintaining the armor she wore every day. Tired of being the person everyone looked to for answers. "All right," she said softly. "Thank you." Over reheated pot roast and carrots, they talked. Not about work, not about quarterly reports or marketing strategies. They talked about life. Thomas told her about raising Sarah, about the fear he'd felt those first years as a single father, not knowing if he was doing anything right. About the pride he felt now, watching his daughter thrive at university, studying environmental science. Margaret shared things she rarely spoke about. Her own daughter, Emily, was 34 now, a doctor in Boston. Margaret had raised her alone too, after her husband left when Emily was just a baby. She'd built her career while juggling motherhood, climbing the corporate ladder one difficult rung at a time. "People think it gets easier," Margaret said, pushing her fork through the carrots on her plate, "when they grow up and leave. But Emily calls me every Sunday, and sometimes I sit by the phone starting at 9 in the morning just waiting." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Sarah texts me photos of her campus, the trees, the buildings, her study group. I think she knows I need to see that she's okay. They take care of us, don't they? Even now, they do." The storm continued its assault on the house, but inside, warmth and understanding filled the spaces between words. They moved to the living room after dinner, and Thomas built a small fire in the fireplace. He didn't use it often, but tonight felt like the right time. Margaret found herself watching Thomas as he arranged the logs, struck the match, coaxed the flames to life. There was something meditative about his movements, unhurried and certain. She realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd simply sat still like this, without her laptop open, without her phone buzzing with messages that demanded immediate attention. "Do you ever wonder what it's all for?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. Thomas settled back into his chair, the firelight casting warm shadows across his face. "The work, you mean? The striving, the climbing. I've spent 40 years trying to prove something, and some nights I come home to my empty apartment and wonder who I was trying to prove it to." Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think we all do that, in different ways. After my wife died, I threw myself into being the perfect father. Every school event, every parent-teacher conference, every bake sale. I was terrified that if I wasn't enough, Sarah would suffer for it." "Were you? Enough?" He smiled. "I made mistakes, plenty of them. But Sarah turned out wonderful, and I don't think it's because I was perfect. I think it's because she knew she was loved, even when I got things wrong." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, some knot she'd been carrying for longer than she could remember. "Emily told me last month that she wishes I would relax more. Enjoy my life. She said I've earned it." She laughed, but it came out sadder than she intended. "I'm not sure I know how. Maybe that's something we can learn," Thomas said gently. "Even at our age." They talked late into the night, long after the tea had grown cold. They talked about their parents, about the lessons learned and the patterns they'd tried to break, about dreams they'd set aside and small joys they'd discovered along the way. Margaret found herself laughing, really laughing, at Thomas's story about trying to help Sarah with her high school chemistry, homework, and accidentally creating a small explosion in the kitchen sink. "The smell didn't leave for a week," he said, his eyes crinkling with the memory. "Sarah still brings it up every Thanksgiving." When Margaret finally admitted she was tired, Thomas showed her to Sarah's room. He'd kept it much as she'd left it, with some of her favorite books still on the shelves and her old quilt, hand-stitched by her grandmother, folded at the foot of the bed. "If you need anything, I'm just across the hall," Thomas said from the doorway. "Thomas," Margaret called softly as he turned to leave. "Thank you. Not just for tonight, but for seeing me, the real me." He smiled, and in that smile was a lifetime of understanding. "Sleep well, Margaret." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having passed in the night. Thomas woke early, as he always did, and made coffee. He found Margaret already in the kitchen, still in the borrowed sweatshirt and pajama pants he'd given her the night before. She was looking out the window, at his garden, where the rain had left everything glistening and fresh. "I called the tow service," she said. "They'll be here within the hour." Thomas poured her a cup of coffee, remembering she took it black. "No rush. I was thinking of making pancakes." They ate breakfast in the morning light, and the conversation flowed as easily as it had the night before. Margaret mentioned a book she'd been trying to find time to read. Thomas had it on his shelf and insisted she borrow it. When the tow truck arrived, Thomas walked Margaret out to the curb. Her car would need work, but it was nothing that couldn't be fixed. She turned to him before getting into the truck, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. Same time next week, she asked, and there was something playful in her voice that he'd never heard before. Maybe without the storm and the car trouble? Thomas felt something warm spread through his chest. Hope, perhaps. Or possibility. I'd like that. I usually make spaghetti on Fridays. I'll bring the wine. At work the following Monday, things were different, but only in the smallest, most important ways. Margaret still commanded the boardroom with confidence, still made decisive calls on major accounts, but when she passed Thomas in the hallway, there was a warmth in her smile that hadn't been there before. And Thomas, reviewing design mock-ups at his desk, found himself looking forward to Friday in a way he hadn't looked forward to anything in years. Friday came, and Margaret arrived at his door at 7, a bottle of red wine in hand, and the book he'd lent her tucked under her arm. She'd already finished it, she said, couldn't put it down. They fell into a rhythm after that. Friday dinners became a constant. Sometimes they cooked together, Thomas teaching Margaret his mother's recipe for dumplings, Margaret sharing her grandmother's secret for the perfect roast chicken. They watched old movies, the kind with happy endings and actors from a gentler era. They took walks through the neighborhood as autumn painted the trees in shades of amber and gold. They talked about everything and nothing, about the news, about books, about memories from their childhoods. Margaret told him about growing up in a small town in Ohio, the youngest of 5 children. Thomas shared stories of his parents, immigrants who'd worked 3 jobs between them to give him opportunities they'd never had. What they were building wasn't rushed or dramatic. It was quiet and steady, like a garden growing. They were learning each other slowly, with patience and attention. One Friday evening in late October, Sarah video called while Margaret was there. Thomas answered, and his daughter's face filled the screen, bright and smiling. "Dad, oh, is someone there? I can call back." No, Thomas said, gesturing Margaret over. "Sarah, this is Margaret. We work together and we've been having dinner on Fridays." Margaret leaned into the frame, feeling suddenly nervous in a way that reminded her of being young again. "Hello, Sarah. Your father talks about you constantly." Sarah's smile grew wider. "Good things, I hope. It's really nice to meet you, Margaret." They chatted for a few minutes, and Margaret found herself instantly charmed by this young woman who had her father's kind eyes and gentle humor. After they hung up, Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That was okay?" he asked. "I should have asked before introducing you." Margaret reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. It was the first time they touched beyond polite handshakes and accidental brushes in the kitchen, and the warmth of it surprised them both. "It was more than okay," she said. The weeks turned to months. Winter came, blanketing Maplewood in snow. Thomas and Margaret celebrated quiet holidays together. She met Sarah when she came home for winter break, and the 3 of them decorated Thomas's Christmas tree while drinking hot chocolate and listening to old carols. Emily came to visit from Boston in January, and Thomas made his pot roast again over dinner. Margaret watched her daughter and this kind man talk about Sarah's environmental science program and Emily's work at the hospital, and she felt a contentment she'd never quite known before. "You seem happy, Mom," Emily said later, as she helped Margaret with the dishes, while Thomas and Sarah debated the merits of various board games in the living room. "I am," Margaret said, and realized it was true. "I really am. He's good for you. You're more relaxed, more yourself." Margaret smiled, handing her daughter a plate to dry. "I think I forgot who myself was somewhere along the way. Thomas is helping me remember." On Valentine's Day, Thomas gave Margaret a small painting he'd created himself, a watercolor of his house on that stormy night, the porch light glowing warm against the darkness and rain. She cried when she saw it, touched it with her fingertips as if it were precious. "You kept your light on," she said. "You kept it on, and I found my way." "I'll always keep it on," Thomas said. "For you." They kissed then, for the first time.